don't know me, I'm Candace Iron. I'm president of the Society for the Study of Architecture in Canada. And I'm also a faculty member and program coordinator at Humber College in the Faculty of Liberal Arts and Sciences and Innovative Learning. I'm very pleased to welcome you to this evening's event to commemorate Canada's first National Day for Truth and Reconciliation. Before we go any further, I'd like to take a quick moment to acknowledge the land. Since we're meeting virtually this evening, I'd first like to acknowledge the Indigenous peoples of all the lands that we're on today. And I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge the importance of the lands which we all call home. We do this to reaffirm our commitment and responsibility in improving relationships between all people and to improve our own understanding of local Indigenous peoples and their cultures. I'm located in Ajax, Ontario, which is also the SSAC's official office location. So I'll focus the remainder of the land acknowledgement on this territory, but I would encourage everyone to think about the land that they are physically on right now. So I'd like to acknowledge that this land is the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe Mississauga, adjacent to the Mississaugas of Scugog Island First Nation, and in the territory covered by the Williams Treaty. This place is and will continue to be home to Indigenous peoples. So let us move forward together with peace, kindness, and respect, and in the spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. All right, so I'll now introduce tonight's speaker, who is Magdalena Miłosz. Magdalena Miłosz is trained as an architect and is currently a doctoral candidate at the Peter Guo School of Architecture at McGill University. Her research examines architecture as a site of encounter between Indigenous peoples and the Canadian settler colonial state, and is supported by the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council, McGill University, the Canadian Centre for Architecture, and the Graham Foundation. She's currently the communications officer of the Society for the Study of Architecture in Canada, as well as the chair of our Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and Sustainability Committee. So Magda, I'm going to pass things over to you.
Thanks so much, Candace, and welcome to everyone joining us tonight. I'm looking forward to our tour later on. So my role is basically to just provide a little talk more specific to architecture and architectural history related to the former Shingwauk Residential School as well as residential schools more generally. This is just a very quick kind of introduction. So if you have any questions at the end, there will be some time for that. So my talk today is called Shingwauk in the National Context of Residential School Architecture. I would also like to begin by acknowledging that I'm joining you today as a visitor in Tiohtià:ke, or Montreal. I recognize and respect the Kanien'kehá:ka as the custodians of these lands and waters, which have long served as a gathering place for many First Nations, including the Huron-Wendat, Abenaki, and Anishinaabe. As practitioners and students of the built environment, I think it's important to reflect on the processes of territorial acquisition undergirding the existence of architecture in settler states like Canada. And that's obviously a very big issue, and hopefully we can have more conversations about this going forward in our field. So with that in mind, I wanted to use my 15 minutes today to put the excellent tour that awaits us into a slightly broader historical and geographical context, particularly as these pertain to architecture. The history of the Shingwauk Residential School is unique, beginning as it does with Chief Shingwauk's vision of a teaching wigwam in the 1830s. Shingwauk was instrumental in establishing the Anishinaabe community of Garden River First Nation as a signatory to the Robinson-Huron Treaty in 1850. And the idea of the teaching wigwam was a way for his people to learn skills such as reading and writing English, which would be important in the context of increasing European settlement, while at the same time allowing them to preserve their language and culture. So here at the top, we see the second Shingwauk home, the precursor to the existing building that we'll see in our tour later on. And this building was completed in 1875. So the first decades of the institution were strongly influenced by Chief Augustine Shingwauk, Shingwauk's son, and the Anglican missionary E.F. Wilson. And both of these men wanted to continue Chief Shingwauk's vision of the teaching wigwam. So it was Wilson who held title to the property in Sault Ste. Marie on which the Shingwauk home was built, some 8 miles away from Garden River. The title was then transferred to the first bishop of the newly formed Anglican Diocese of Algoma, Frederick Folkey, who held it in trust, quote, for the use of the Indian Industrial Institution, end quote. And historian Jean Menor argues that a legal trust relationship was thus established over the school between the Garden River community and the Anglican Church. And this legal responsibility was also supported by Canada through the Governor General Lord Dufferin, who in his speech at the laying of the Shingwauk home's cornerstone stated that the Crown was, quote, under the very gravest obligations toward the Anishinaabe and had the duty of providing for their future welfare. So the initial building was a 3-story stone structure with a hipped roof, and it was a large building that still sort of possessed the somewhat domestic character. Wilson himself became the institution's principal, and the wing that is visible on the right, so I'm not sure if you can see my cursor, but this section that's kind of jutting forward from the main part of the building was his family's quarters. In 1883, the Bishop Folkey Memorial Chapel, which is seen on the bottom, was constructed as a freestanding building to the southeast of the home. So students of the institution, so Indigenous children and young people, were involved in the construction of the chapel, and I believe you will learn more about the chapel during the tour. So like many other early missionary-run residential schools, the Shingwauk home saw a lot of expansion during its first decades. An entrance hall for visitors was constructed, and a newly completed wing became a residence for the principal and his family in 1882. So that's the principal's wing that I mentioned on the previous slide. So Wilson had a keen interest in architecture and kept a journal illustrated with his own watercolors and drawings, including one of his home in England, as well as scenes of missionary work in Canada. And this plan that's up on the screen right now, entitled Our Private Rooms at the Shingwauk Home, shows, again, his family's quarters with penciled in furniture, which sort of reveals his enthusiasm for interior design. And although the dwelling was connected directly to the rest of the school, so the section here that says our bedroom and bedroom, that was actually part of the main block. The drawing sort of interestingly shows its walls extending towards nothingness, hinting at a link, but sort of stopping short, so separating his family life from the lives of the children who attended his institution. So Wilson also, I meant to show this. Wilson also started a girls' school 2.5 miles from the Shingwauk home in 1877, partly due to objections from townspeople that boys and girls were being lodged together at the Shingwauk home. So the Wawanosh home, as it was known, opened with 8 pupils being taught in the back wing, while the rest of the building was still under construction, although its capacity was eventually enlarged to 26 children, and also included a playroom. The property of about 5 acres had a stable, laundry, and laundress's cottage. And despite its distance from the boys' school, the 2 institutions bore a striking resemblance to one another, adopting, again, a fairly domestic appearance, as did early missionary-run residential schools elsewhere in much of the country. So further south from the Shingwauk home towards the St. Mary's River, a tramway used to transport the school's water supply as well as goods coming by boat led to the construction of an extensive industrial complex. And this was built in 1889 through an annual new construction grant. The addition included a, quote, sash and door factory with facilities for manufacture of furniture, etc., end quote, along with a stone veneered cottage for the foreman. Inmates of the school worked at the factory to produce materials for future building projects. which Wilson also imagined would be done by students, thus minimizing the cost of new construction. So the factory was used temporarily as a dormitory until the following year, when the annual building grant permitted the addition of a west wing to the Shingwauk home, which you can see here to the left of the original building. So this addition contained a kitchen, boys' bathrooms, and lavatory on the first level, and a dormitory and reading room on the second. And Wilson estimated that the institution could accommodate 74 children, increasing the combined capacity of Shingwauk and the Wamanosh girls' home to 100. So the federal government began investing in residential schools as a matter of national policy following Nicholas Flood Davin's 1879 report, shown here. And in this report, Davin recounted his visits to boarding schools for Indigenous children in the United States and recommended that Canada adopt a similar policy as a means of assimilating Indigenous peoples in the context of European settler colonization. So this meant that many existing religious schools for Indigenous children, run primarily by the Roman Catholic, Anglican, Methodist, Presbyterian, and later United churches, became increasingly entangled with the aims of the settler state. Both the Shingwauk and Wamanosh homes became part of this network of federally funded institutions in 1879. So this first generation of residential schools, as art historian Jeffrey Carr has termed it, consisted of these smaller, more domestic architectures built by the churches, as well as larger so-called industrial schools built by the Federal Department of Public Works. And all of these institutions focused on the religious and cultural conversion of Indigenous children, but sort of varied in their focus on teaching trades, farming, and domestic work as a means of enabling participation in the settler economy. So my working hypothesis is that the increasing involvement of the Federal Department of Indian Affairs in the architectural design of the schools was strongly influenced by Dr. Peter Henderson Bryce's 1907 report, which you can see on the screen. Bryce was a medical doctor with a background in public health, and he became chief medical officer of the department in 1904. And in this report, Bryce documented extremely high infection and death rates from tuberculosis of children at 33 residential schools in Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba. So Bryce blamed the TB epidemic on both the admission of infected children and environmental factors like overcrowding and poor ventilation, focusing very much on the actual buildings of the schools. And so although Bryce's work focused on the prairie provinces, the eventual result of his findings was influential in changing how residential schools looked across the country. In 1911, the government came out with a contract that was to be signed between the government and the churches operating the schools. And this was the first of its kind, which was sort of remarkable considering the state's involvement in these institutions for 3 decades already at this point. So the contract pegged federal per child funding to certain standards, including air and floor space minimums, as well as other amenities. And administrators were thus motivated to improve or rebuild their institutions to obtain higher grants. And it's my contention that the architects of Indian Affairs were increasingly called upon to design and supervise the construction of renovations or entirely new residential schools following these contracts. So in Shingwauk's case, Wilson, the missionary in principle, resigned in 1893. And this was followed by the closure of the Wamanosh home because the church could no longer afford to operate 2 separate institutions. And Shingwauk suffered from a long period of financial precarity. And then as early as 1919, a report to Indian Affairs noted a need for extensive repairs. And then finally in 1931, what was once known as Indian Affairs flagship school was condemned. So bureaucrats blamed the wartime freeze and Depression-era reductions in funding, although as historian John Malloy has shown, underfunding was a notoriously chronic problem in the residential schools that persistently affected not only the condition of the building stock, but the well-being and survival of children in the system. So since the 1920s, schools with a similar design as Shingwauk's new building, the building that still exists on Algoma University's campus today, had been built across the country. And these were rigidly symmetrical 3-story buildings with a central block and 2 wings. That was their usual design. And this design aided in the separation of boys and girls, as well as children of different ages within the institution, which permitted this kind of very rigid institutional control. The earlier of these designs, such as the Edmonton and St. Paul's residential schools, which were both in Alberta, were styled in this sort of Collegiate Gothic that was popular for college and high school buildings in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And these were firmly of the second generation of residential schools, ever more influenced by the centralized settler colonial bureaucracy administering Indigenous nations across the entire country. So yet between these earlier schools of the 1920s and the eventual construction of Shingwauk's new building in 1935, a different style of architecture marked new residential schools. These buildings were designed with elements of the classical modern style in use at the time, particularly for government buildings. And these elements included a balanced and symmetrical form, flat roofs, stylized parapet, and an added Gothic stone entry arch, which, like the previous style, lends a kind of very, if not totally uniform, quite a similar appearance to these institutions in very different places across Canada. Yet despite their significantly different exteriors and the fact that they were designed by the same government architect, these newer residential schools maintained largely the same sort of rigidly controlled plan as their predecessors. So I just wanted to finish up with this, the initial design for Shingwauk, for the new Shingwauk building, the one that still exists and which you're about to see in the tour, from about 1932, followed one model, but ultimately came to more closely resemble the older style from the 1920s. So this design process speaks a little bit to how entangled residential schools became at the national scale, not only in terms of their exteriors and interiors, but also in how they function and where the power lay in how they were operated. It's important to remember that these institutions function to destroy Indigenous cultures in the settler colonial context of Canada's development. And again, that their similarity, if not complete uniformity, reflected this larger overarching system that affected very diverse Indigenous nations across Canada. So I'm going to end there, but I very much look forward to now the tour that will kind of bring you a little bit more into the, very much into this space that still exists. And so Shingwauk is one of very few residential school buildings that still stands, and so it's a very valuable historical and educational resource. And I'm so happy that that we're able to even virtually go inside and learn more about the lives of the children who live there, and how residential schools affected this community, specifically in Sault Ste. Marie. Thank you so much for joining us. So this is Jenna Lemay, who is a digital archives technician at the Shingwauk Residential School Centre, and she will be leading us through a virtual tour of the existing former Shingwauk Residential School on the campus of Algoma University. So the Shingwauk Residential School Centre is a joint initiative with the Children of Shingwauk Alumni Association, whose mission is to provide for the well-being of the Children of Shingwauk alumni who are former students of the Shingwauk and Wawanosh Indian residential schools, their families, and their communities. And so I'm very pleased to pass it over to Jenna, and very much look forward to the tour. Thank you.
Awesome, thank you. So this is Shingwauk Hall here. So usually when we do tours, I sort of start off with a bit of the history of the site before we actually get into specific features on the site. So the history of a residential school on this site in Sault Ste. Marie goes back to the early 1800s. with Chief Shingwauk, who was chief of the Garden River Band. In Sault Ste. Marie, we have two bands. There's Garden River and Batchewana. There's also a large Métis community as well. So Chief Shingwauk was chief of the Garden River Band, and he was very interested in making sure that as more settlers were coming to the Sault Ste. Marie area, his people still had control over their own land, control over their own destinies, and had the skills to be able to move forward together with the settler people. So really thinking about that Truro Wampum Treaty from the 1700s. So I don't know how many of you know about that, but it's basically 2 rows of white wampum beads in a sea of purple, or I think it might be the other way around. But it basically says that, you know, we're going to go along life side by side, and we're not going to, you know, interfere with each other, kind of thing. So I'm really kind of thinking about, you know, living life that way in the Sault Ste. Marie area. So he felt that the best way for people to move forward was to have cultural exchange, so to learn from each other and basically take the best of both worlds. So he had what he called a vision of a teaching wigwam. So this was a space for people to come together and learn from each other. And so he really advocated strongly for this. He actually snowshoed all the way from Sault Ste. Marie to Toronto, which is a really, really far distance, to ask for a teacher to be sent to Sault Ste. Marie to set up a school for this purpose. Throughout the early 1800s, not a few missionaries came, but nobody really stayed for very long. There was a few day schools that were set up both on the reserve and in town, but didn't last too long. And Chief Shingwauk died in 1854 without seeing his vision realized, but his sons Augustine and Bokwajinene took up that vision of cross-cultural education and continued to advocate for a teacher to be sent to Sault Ste. Marie. And Augustine also went to Toronto, but he hopped on a boat instead of snowshoeing, so he got there a lot faster and asked for a teacher to be sent. In 1871, Reverend Edward Wilson came. He had previously worked as a missionary in the Sarnia, like Walpole Island region, with the reserves down there. So he was familiar with Indigenous, specifically Ojibwe culture. He spoke the language and was really inspired by Chief Shingwauk's vision to create an education space. So he took up the cause to help Augustine and Bokwajinene, and they went on lots of funding tours. Bokwajinene actually went to England with Wilson on a funding tour. And so eventually they gathered up enough money and they built a school on Garden River. And this one was just a wooden schoolhouse, fairly small. I think it was basically kind of like a one-room schoolhouse kind of thing. And it actually burnt down 6 days after it opened. And although it is not confirmed and probably never will be confirmed that it was arson, it likely was arson because what he created was a residential school and not actually fulfilling Chief Shingwauk's vision. So he was interested in Chief Shingwauk's vision, but took that vision and worked it. And so a lot of people in Garden River weren't happy with the type of school he was setting up. So that's why it was likely arson that burnt down the building. Wilson and Bokwajinene continued to raise funds to build a new building. And so that building, they selected this site here along the St. Mary's River, which is, I think it's about 15 kilometers away from Garden River. And it's a 90-acre site. And so they decided to build a stone building on this site. So I have a couple pictures of what that original building looked like. So this is a picture. The original building was just this rectangular piece here. This was a later addition a few years later. So this was built in 1874 and was known as the Shingwauk Home. So you can see the sign on the front there. And it was built from local sandstone. So much of the stones were collected actually from the site and from the surrounding area. So like I said, this is built in 1874 and operated on the industrial school model. So when students were here, they spent half day in school. Their education was mainly focused on religion. So they had like Bible classes, they were taught Latin, English, just various things that they needed to understand the Christian religion. The school was Anglican run by the Anglican Church. And then the other half of their day was spent practicing a trade. And so at various different times in Shingwauk's history, there's various different trades available to the students. Carpentry and farming were two of the longer lasting trades, but there was also a print shop on site that printed a magazine called the Algoma Missionary News, which had news from the school, but also sort of general missionary news from the Algoma region. Students could also apprentice in town with blacksmiths, tinsmiths. I think there was a wagon maker at one point, various different trades. And when this school first opened, it was a school for both boys and girls. But I think within a year, it was switched to being just a home for boys. And in 1879, a separate building was built for girls called the Wawanosh Home. So that's just this main building here. This building is actually from the 30s, I think, after the Wawanosh closed and the building was sold off. So this is when the Children's Aid Society was in the building. So it didn't have this extension on it, was just this central building here, but it's very similar looking to Shingwauk, similar construction, sort of a Georgian style building. And that was built in 1879 and operated on a similar model. So the education was mainly focused on religion, and then the girls would spend the other half of the day usually doing domestic tasks. So they were learning to sew, to cook, to clean, to do laundry. And that's what they were expected to do when they left the school, either working for their own family or working as kind of like a maid or household helper in somebody else's house. The Wawanosh building closed in about 1870 or 1897, a little under 20 years after it opened. It was quite a rundown building at that point. It was overcrowded and there was an outbreak of a skin disease. So the school closed, and a few years later, an extension was built onto Shingwauk. So this part over here with the little tower, that's the original building. This is the principal's wing that was added. And then this over here is the extension that was built when the girls were brought into the school. So from then on, it was both a girls and boys school, but continued to operate on that industrial school model. In 1935, or I guess 1934, the building, the original Shingwauk home building was quite run down. Didn't have running water, didn't have electricity, didn't have proper ventilation, was overcrowded. It was just generally an old building. A lot of the buildings didn't have a lot of money for upkeep. So the government and the church, who were jointly funding the school and running the school at that time, decided it was actually cheaper to build a new building. So they built Shingwauk Hall in 1935. So this building here shows both Shingwauk Hall and the old Shingwauk home on the site. There's some other buildings around. So here is the chapel, which we'll talk about in a little bit. And there's also a carpentry shop and various other buildings around the site. There's barn out here. I think there might have been another barn over here. So those two buildings were there for about a year together at the same time. And then the original building was torn down. So that would be on the front lawn over here. So I'll just move up a little bit closer to the front lawn here. So that would have been along the front lawn here. And this monument over here is actually built from the same stones as the original building. This monument was set up when the original building was torn down. And it is a monument to Principal Wilson. So it's a very colonialistic monument, very propagandistic monument. And the placement is really specific. It's facing the street. And so it's basically saying, look at the good work we're doing here, which is also the intention of the buildings as well. It was put up while the school was still running, while it was still operational as a residential school. So again, basically a piece of propaganda. Just while we're over here on the monuments, I'll just mention this monument here was basically set up in response to that monument. Just zoom in here a little bit so you can see it better. So this is set up by the Children of Shanghai Alumni Association, which I'll talk about in a moment, in 2012. And it was pretty much in response to the monument behind, and the placing is a really specific placement. it is facing the school because the message of this with the 7 grandfather teachings is saying to the school and to the people who run it, you tried to take away our culture, but you failed. It's still here and we are still here. So very, very intentional placement with this monument. So like I said, this was built in 1935. It operated as a residential school until 1970. And at that point, the school had kind of moved on from the industrial school model, and students were doing full day school, but they were also still doing lots of chores around the building. So students still had to clean, and they still had to do some farming as well, because the farmlands and the gardens were meant to sustain the school. So those still had to be run. Students were still doing that. They were cooking their own food, cleaning the building, and various other chores. So they still had lots of work, lots of manual labor to do around the site, in addition to their schooling, which often was not quite adequate. So that continued on from the 30s to the 50s. Around that time, there was 2 public schools that opened on the back of the property, an elementary school and a high school. So students sort of phased out from attending school in the Shingwauk building and began attending school in the public schools, but they still lived here in the Shingwauk building and still had all those chores and duties to do around the building. When the Shingwauk closed in 1970, it was sort of a part of a wider closing of residential schools across the country. The government was pulling out of funding the schools, so many of them had to close. They couldn't afford to stay open. So Shingwauk was one of those buildings that closed as part of that general movement. There were still a number of other schools that were open afterwards. So the last residential school didn't close until 1996, the Gordon Residential School in Saskatchewan. After the Shingwauk Residential School closed in 1970, Algoma University College moved in a year later, and they've been on the site ever since. At that point, when Algoma University College moved in, if you had have asked people what this building was, probably nobody would have said it was a residential school. You would have had some people who thought it was an orphanage or maybe a hospital. Because of the style of the building. I know somebody else is talking about, what are the sort of specific differences. I think a lot of people wouldn't necessarily recognize the differences between the buildings. But there was also some intentional forgetting as well. Nobody wanted to recognize it as a residential school and sort of come to terms with, what had gone on in this building. 10 years later, the Shingwauk survivors decided to come together and hold a reunion. And originally this was intended to be kind of like a high school reunion, basically. They wanted to come together and see old friends and reminisce. And they were expecting about 150 people to show up. So they always have a joke about eating traditional KFC at this first reunion because they were expecting this small number of people. They had ordered catering from a traditional caterer. The menu said traditional food, and then about 400 people showed up to the reunion. So they had to order KFC. So lots of survivors will joke about having traditional KFC at this reunion. But this was a really groundbreaking event because the survivors did come together and start talking about the things that happened at the residential school. So it wasn't really just a typical high school reunion. And out of that, the Children of Shingwauk Alumni Association was born, and they created the Shingwauk Project, which is sort of the predecessor to the Shingwauk Residential Schools Centre. And that was meant to be a place where the survivors could share the photos, the documents, the information they were bringing to the reunions, the interviews that were conducted at those reunions. They really wanted to make sure that that information and that their experiences in residential school were shared with the wider public. So again, remembering that residential schools federally were still open at this time. This is really, really incredible for the survivors to get together and be doing this kind of thing. So they are still very involved in what we do at the Shingwauk Residential School Centre, involved in every step of every project all along the way. So as we've been developing this tour, they've been very involved in creating the content and helping decide how their experiences are told. So a couple notes about Shingwauk Hall. Since you are an architecture group, I know you talked about this a little bit earlier. I missed the first part of the presentation here. But this building was designed by Roland B. Orr, who was an architect for the Department of Indian Affairs. So he created a lot of the other residential school buildings across Canada. So a couple other ones that are very similar construction. I'm sure you saw some of these pictures earlier. This is Kamloops. So you can see, you know, it's got that sort of central tower, a central entranceway, and, you know, large imposing wings. This is the Edmonton Residential School, which looks almost exactly identical to Shingwauk. And I also like to bring up the Mohawk Residential School, although not designed. I don't think it's designed by Roland B. Orr, and it's not created in the same period. It is of a very similar construction with that central tower, very large imposing building in the wings. So I always like to show that too as an example of just sort of the conformity of the residential school buildings and the intention to, you know, have them, you know, look very similar, be very imposing. So this is, as I'm sure you guys talked about earlier, Collegiate Gothic style, which is, you know, very focused on monumentalization and meant to be very imposing to the students, specifically because a lot of the students would have come from communities where this would have been the largest building they had ever seen. So that would have been, you know, really scary for them just because of the size. But also for a lot of them too, this would have been the first brick building they had seen as well. So this is an entirely new type of building that they had never experienced before, which really heightens those feelings of isolation and distance from their home community and just, you know, feelings of being scared. So that also ties into the entranceway. And I know I caught just the very end of your presentation earlier. So I know you guys talked a little bit about the entranceway. But it is, you know, very, very imposing, this large archway. And a lot of survivors have talked about how when they walked through these doors for the first time, their lives completely changed. Their lives were never the same after they walked through these doors. And when they would have come to the school, they would have gone through these front doors, but that would have been the only time they went through these front doors. Every other time they would have entered through the back door. And so this, you know, was just kind of another way of othering them, of sort of hiding them away, making them feel very isolated. And so a lot of the survivors make a very specific point to always enter the building through the front door because that was something that was forbidden to them. The residential school center is actually in the east wing over here. So if you're trying to come into the center, it actually is easier to come in through these doors down here. But despite that, the survivors always make a point to enter through these doors. I see them walking up the stairs all the time. And they have talked about how that is a very specific rebellion for them to go through the front doors here. Another point about Shingwauk Hall, similar to construction of other residential school buildings, is it is on an H-shaped plan. So a lot of the other buildings were on that kind of similar plan. Some of them may have an E shape, a U shape, but again, it's very much about you know, a monumental building, a really imposing building, and a really, really institutionalized building. Again, when you think about the types of buildings that students experienced at home, especially if they were coming from a more isolated, more traditional community, this would have been a really, really stark contrast in the type of building. Okay, I'm going to jump over to the chapel. So the chapel here is one of the only buildings that still exists from the early period of the residential school building, or residential school site, sorry. This was built in 1883, and it is a memorial chapel to Bishop Folkey. The Bishop Folkey was the first bishop of the Algoma region, and he and Wilson worked very closely to run the residential school and, you know, to decide on what was going on here. Folkey was very, very much involved in that. And so when the school first opened, the students were actually attending a church in town. So they were walking about 4 kilometers to a church in Sault Ste. Marie. And they would have, been spending all day there and then had to walk back at the end of the day. So Wilson and Folkey decided it actually made more sense to build a chapel on site. So the chapel actually took quite a number of years. I think they were wanting to start building it in like 1879, but it didn't get built until 1883 because they were basically crowdsourcing. That was how the residential school was funded in the early years before the government got on board with it. Basically, they were just funded by donations. So they were putting out lots of advertisements, going on funding tours, and it took a long time to get up enough funding to build the chapel. So it wasn't built until a number of years later. And Bishop Folkey actually died in 1881. So he didn't get to see the chapel constructed. And so that was why it's a memorial chapel to him. When they were deciding to build the chapel, Bishop Folkey was the one who selected the site for the chapel. And they did sort of a weird kind of ceremony with the students where they had them all gather. So similar to the original building, the stones are all sandstone collected locally from the site, which the students themselves had to collect. And that was part of some of the work they had to do around the site, was to collect up these stones. And so they had all the students come together and lay a stone in the outline of the building and promise to help build the chapel. So the students who built all the carpentry on the inside, which I'll show you in a moment, obviously they would have put in actual manual labor to build the chapel. The students who collected the stones would have put in manual labor to build the chapel. But in addition to that, during lunch, students had to go without syrup, and the money that would have normally been spent on their syrup was spent to pay for so students would have helped to build the chapel in more ways than just physical labor. So just kind of going around the chapel here to show you what it looks like. It is a very unique style. It's a Tudor Gothic style, and it is designed by Reverend Wilson, by that first principal of the residential school, who had very particular ideas about lots of things related to the school. So we'll go inside so I can show you what that looks like. So all of the woodwork in here, so all the pulpits, or sorry, all the benches, the pulpit here, move up a little bit so you can see that closer. The pulpit, there is bishop's seat back here. I'm pretty sure this carving all here is all done by the children who were in the carpentry shop here. So as I mentioned, when the school was doing that industrial school model, some students would be working in the carpentry shop. So they really did most of the woodworking in here. We do know a few of their names. I always can't remember all of them. I think there's 4 that we know of. One of them was Edward Jackson, who I think was the sort of head carpenter in the shop. He was about 17 at the time, but the other boys would have been between 12 and 15. So the woodworking in here is really, really incredible. It's really, really well done. And often when we have people come through for tours, when we talk about the woodwork in here, they always say, oh, well, at that time, that would have been a really great skill for them to have, which is true. But I always kind of hate when people bring that up because it feels like they're sort of trying to justify the school by saying, oh, well, they didn't get a great education, but they got this great skill, which would have been important at the time. Which it was an important skill to have at the time in the late 1800s. But because of the way the residential school operated and the way it was set up and the intention behind it, the connections that students had with their home community were stripped away from them. So they gained this great skill, but couldn't go home to practice it in their home communities. And because of the racism and sort of the distrust of Indigenous people having good skills, despite the fact that they're educated in this Christian school, nobody in town would want to hire an Indigenous person. They always felt that settler people had better skills than Indigenous people. So the students were kind of burned both ways, where they couldn't go home and practice this skill in their home community, but they couldn't practice it in town either. So despite this being a good education for the time, they actually couldn't use it at all. So this is, I think it's one of the oldest chapels in Ontario, and it is, a really good example of some early architecture in Sault Ste. Marie and just in Ontario in general. It's a really, really incredible building. Very, very cold inside because of the stonework. In the wintertime, we usually don't take people inside to do tours because it's usually colder inside the building than it is outside. So for students, especially in the earlier years when temperatures were lower and it would have been colder in the wintertime, it would have been pretty uncomfortable to be inside this building. One of the other buildings on the site is this principal's residence here. So this is built at the same time as Shingwauk Hall in 1935. So when I showed you that picture of the original building with that little extension that came out the front, that was the principal's wing on the original building. When Shingwauk Hall was built in 1935, it was decided to build a separate building for the principal. When the principal was at the school, they lived there with their families and children. So very similar construction to Shingwauk Hall in that it's the red brick. You can't see it because it's got the awning on it, but the entrance is pretty much identical to Shingwauk Hall with that stone archway. So again, this would have been the home for the principal and his family. And this was also a place where students had to carry out one of the chores that some of them had to do, which was serving the principal and staff their food. And a lot of students, a lot of survivors have spoken about the really poor quality of food that they received at the residential school. Mike Kakaji, who's one of the survivors from Shingwauk, has talked about watching staff wash moldy meat and asking what that was. And they said that it was his dinner that night. The Mohawk Indian Residential School is known as the mush hole by survivors because they distinctly remember the really unappetizing porridge that they had to eat. So a lot of survivors have talked about the really poor quality food and being hungry all the time. A lot of Shingwauk survivors have spoken about going out to the dump and foraging for food there, stealing chickens from in town, or going out to try and secretly snare rabbits and birds and things like that. So they were always looking for other ways to get food because they weren't getting adequate food from the school. So when it was a student's task to serve the principal and staff their food, it was really obvious the contrast in the kind of food that the staff were getting versus the kind of food that the students were getting. So as I mentioned, students, helping to build the chapel by going without syrup. No way would the staff have gone without syrup. Most of the garden vegetables and things that they grew on the farm were either sold in town or the staff ate them. The students rarely ever got to eat them. They didn't get many vegetables except for root vegetables. They didn't get much food, but the staff would have always gotten that kind of food. So it was really, really obvious to the students, who was favored at the school. Jackie Fletcher, who's one of the survivors that we work very close with, she remembers it was her task to serve the staff their food. And whenever they had pork chops, she would always sneak a pork chop into her apron because that was never the kind of food that they got. She loved pork chops. Jackie's a very funny lady, and I just love that story and the image of her sneaking pork chops into her apron. Since the closure of the residential school, this building has been used by the Shingwauk Education Trust, which is a trust that was set up by Wilson in the early years of the residential school that basically says that this site has to always be used for Indigenous education. So the trust has members of Garden River, it has members of the Anglican Church, members of Algoma University, and they sort of, jointly decide the kinds of things that happen on this site. Again, to make sure that it goes back to that point of always being used for Indigenous education. So related to that point, Shingwauk Kanumagegamik is the Indigenous university that was founded by SET and is joint with Algoma University. So they are the university that operates the Anishinaabe Studies program and the Anishinaabe-Moan program through Algoma University, which are the only programs of their kind. There's no other program for Anishinaabe Studies and no other Anishinaabe-Moan program in Canada. So they're really, really important programs that are run by Shingwauk Residential. And they used to be housed in this building, but recently they actually built a building across the street. When we had the photos for the tour done, the building wasn't quite finished, so we can't actually get up very close to get a good view of it. But this is it over here. The construction of this building, especially the center part, which is kind of a little bit hard to see because of the clouds, but there's sort of a white kind of long dome in the middle there. And it's intended to look like a lodge. So the inside is all wood ceilings, very open, very expansive, really drawing on Indigenous architecture as inspiration. So this building is almost open now. Because of COVID, we haven't been able to have students inside the building yet. But eventually it will be open to students. There's lots of classroom space in there. The center lodge space is actually a library and archives. So it's a really great research space for students to come into. There's a really great atrium at the back that has really beautiful views of the back of the property and the river. So the river is just behind, a little ways behind the building there. So you can see the tree line there, river is just beyond. And this past weekend, actually, they built a teaching lodge behind the building, which is, again, lodge shaped like this building in the center part, but it's built with sticks and small saplings that were collected from around the site. So that is going to be a really great space for a lot of the land-based education that goes on this site. So really, really exciting stuff going on at Shingwauk Residential. Okay, I'm going to really briefly speak about the cemetery here, just because cemetery stuff is so much in the news. And then I'll go back to Shingwauk Hall and show you inside. The cemetery here has been in use since the residential school first opened, or 2 years after, actually. 1876 was when this area was consecrated. But as most of you probably know at this point, every residential school had a cemetery attached to it. Because, you know, they are places where people live, they are obviously places where people die, but because of the poor conditions and poor treatment of students at the residential school, the death rates were much higher here than on reserves and in the wider Canadian population. So the stone wall you see around here goes all the way down here around the back. This is the original cemetery, so it comes across back here. In the 1920s, so I'll go back up here. So it's all out here and all down here. This fence up here was put in sometime in the 90s, I believe. I'm trying to sort of narrow down the date. But we know that there are burials outside of this fence. We have survivors who remember digging graves outside of this fence area. We do have a site search ongoing right now that started this past weekend. Haven't started work in the cemetery, but that is another phase that hopefully will eventually happen, and we'll actually be able to figure out if this fence is actually the proper boundaries for the cemetery and how far that actually goes. In 1981, when the survivors had that first reunion, they came back to the cemetery, and the cemetery was in a state of disrepair. Most of the graves just had wooden markers, wooden crosses, and those had deteriorated or fallen to vandalism. So you can see in old pictures of the cemetery, there's actually multiple rows of headstones all along here, none of which exist anymore. I guess I shouldn't call them headstones because they're not stones, they were just wood markers. But because of the fact that most of the markers are gone, the CSAA set up this monument, which is known as the Cairn, and that's the monument to all of the people who are buried in the cemetery, so both staff and students, and there are a few community members as well. We know of 110 burials, I believe, in the cemetery, 72 of which are students. Okay, I'm going to go back to Shingwauk Hall. Actually, I'll go inside. So this is the interior of Shingwauk Hall. This is the Reclaiming Shingwauk Hall exhibition space. And there are multiple sort of sections of it. You come through the main doors here. And I didn't mention this before, but these main doors are actually original to 1935. They don't close properly, and they're not actually really great quality doors because they're so old. But you know, what I mentioned before about those doors being so formative for survivors, they were really intentional about stating that those doors need to stay there. So despite the fact that they don't close properly and are deteriorating, they are still original to the building because they are a focal point to talk about survivor experiences. So you come through those doors, there is a Thunderbird model here. And so the Thunderbird is a guiding figure meant to guide you through the exhibit. This section along here starts down here on this end of the hall and comes all the way across. That talks about the history of the Shingwauk site. So talks about the industrial school period, talks about Wawanosh. Over here talks about Shingwauk Hall, you can see the picture there, talks about the integration into public schools and the closing of the school. This section along this wall and down here talks about the survivors. So we can look a little bit closer at Mike's picture here. So it's got the pictures of survivors. Eventually there'll be hotspots. This one is not a functional hotspot yet, but it'll be places for people to read about survivors and survivor experiences and the things that they're proud of in their lives outside of residential schools. Doesn't specifically have to be about residential schools. But this part of the exhibit is titled, "We're All Children of Shingwauk." So really talking about and really focusing on survivors. This section of the exhibit down here talks about Indigenous education in this area. So it starts off talking about Shingwauk's vision there, talks about those early missionary periods that I mentioned up to 1871 when Wilson came. And then down here, the history of the Shingwauk Residential School specifically, down to 1970 when the school closed. And this is the second part of the exhibit. So this area, again, really focuses on student experience at the residential school. So it starts over here in, you know, experiences in those early missionary schools into the industrial school period. So this area over here talks about the print shop. This talks about the carpentry shop, some information about the kinds of work that the girls were doing at Wawanosh, sewing, and there's a sewing machine. Over here on this side, sorry, again, this tour is in beta. Over here, it talks about the dormitories. We'll go up there quickly in a moment. It's just classroom space now, but I'll just sort of show you what the room looks like. Very, very crowded, total lack of privacy in those rooms. They're quite small rooms and you would have up to 50 students in there at a time. So this panel here just sort of talks about that experience. And then I'll go into the auditorium here. So the auditorium is one of the only spaces in Shingwauk Hall that still looks almost identical to the way it did in the residential school period. And this is actually the third phase of the project, the exhibition project, which is under construction right now. So it's very exciting. I think we're hoping to have it open sometime in the next couple months. So all of this lighting here, which is new, is going to be taken down. There's a sound box here that's been taken down. And this part of the exhibition space will talk about colonization of Indigenous people sort of more broadly, rather than just focusing on Canada or just focusing on Sault Ste. Marie. And it's also doing that through art. So there's going to be a lot of interactive art activities going on in here, and hopefully some language activities as well. So, you know, sort of taking that story of colonization and making this a space for decolonization. The auditorium, for some survivors, is one of the places where they have some happy memories of the residential school period. This was the only space where they could talk to their siblings. When you were in the school, you weren't allowed to talk to your siblings at all, especially not if they were of another gender. but also if they were of the same gender. So if you were a girl and you had a younger sister, you were not allowed to interact with her, except for in situations like being in the auditorium. In the later years, things were a bit more lax. So students would have dances and parties and concerts and various things like that, where they could interact with everybody else at the school. So Irene Barbeau, who's one of the survivors we work with, she talks a lot about coming to dances and getting really excited because she got to spend time with the boys. She's a very giggly person, and so she always giggles when talking about getting to dance with the boys in the auditorium. So that was partially why this was selected as the space to continue telling this story and to be that kind of decolonizing space. So I will really briefly just go upstairs to show you the dormitory space, and then we'll have some time for questions. So just quickly, I'll show you what the classroom looks like. So this is today a classroom. In the residential school period, this would have been the senior girls' dorm. So there would have been beds all along the walls, side by side. Again, a lot of a lack of privacy and lack of just sort of personal space. A lot of survivors have spoken about, again, that sort of contrast to, you know, being at home, coming into this space that's very, very crowded, where you don't really have much space to yourself.
Okay, thanks so much, Jenna. I really appreciate it. I'm sure everyone really appreciates everything that you're doing, and also the tour that you gave today. You know, to really give us something to think about, particularly, you know, the change of seasons and going into our first National Day of Truth and Reconciliation. So I just wanted to say thank you on behalf of the SSAC, and again to thank everyone who made this evening's events possible. You know, when we first began speaking about this event and Magda started really planning things and speaking to you and putting things together, I heard from a lot of people who said this would be a really difficult evening and this would be a difficult event. I guess I just want to acknowledge that issues of colonialism and of residential schools in particular are difficult and they are emotional, but I tend to also think that sometimes we need to be uncomfortable and we need to discuss difficult topics, particularly if we're going to do better as a society, and if we're going to do things like demand better from others, from the country, from our government, in order to foster equity, really, I think, for all people. And I think through the work of people like Magda, who is doing incredible research and who's spent years researching the architecture of colonialism in residential schools in particular, and through the efforts of those who run sites like the Shingwauk Residential School Centre, and who are so generous with their time and their effort and their knowledge, that really we're able to make strides towards reconciliation. So thank you so much, Jenna, for everything that you're doing. And thanks also to everyone who joined us this evening. I've been looking at the names, and it's obviously a lot of SSAC members, and it's great to know that you've joined us. I normally don't get to see you until June, but a lot of others as well. So friends and family members, colleagues, and what have you. So thank you all for joining us tonight. And I really just want to wish everyone a safe and thoughtful evening. And with that, I'll say goodbye for now. And just thanks to everyone.